I use Aldo Leopold's land ethic as the foundation of the course. It's one of the first things that we dive into as a class. We really want to understand what an ethic is, and how ethics shape the way we think about different things. And I know in land ethic, Leopold states like a land ethic changes the role of the human from a conqueror to just a plain ordinary citizen of the biotic community. And that, I think, is the goal of the course, is to allow students to see the woodlot and to see the natural world as something that they are a part of, rather than something they're apart from.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode is all about forest education. More specifically, it is about creating empathy for the land, creating a connection to forests that lasts a lifetime and creates citizens that are more involved. And to do that, a gentleman by the name of Jim Lane, who is a science teacher, high school science teacher in Minnesota, he reached out to me about this course that he has been teaching for the last, I'm not sure how long now, but for years now. And it is a field ecology and conservation course, is what he calls it. And this course, it immediately caught my attention because the concept of the way he sold it to me was teaching empathy for the land. Now, that's something you don't think about teaching high school students. You think about teaching them, if you're taking them out in the bush, you think about teaching them about the facts. What is a tree? What kind of tree is it? What does it do? You know, the Krebs cycle, all that type of stuff. This is different. This is something more tangible, more real, more effective in creating connection in people's lives and changing the way they think about the world around them. So I immediately jumped on it, and you're going to love this conversation. It's just a really enjoyable conversation about how can we make education real for people. And I really loved it. I know you're going to love it too. Jim did an incredible job. His passion comes through in the way he talks, explaining this concept. It's so great. Sponsors for this episode. West Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2023. This would not be possible without West Fraser. Thank you for your support. I really, really do appreciate it. Couldn't be done without you. And also Greenlink Forestry. Been with me since the beginning. Couldn't do it without them. Thank you, Greenlink. Now, without any further messing around, let's talk creating empathy for the land with Jim Lane. Here we go. Awesome. So, first of all, Jim, thanks so much for joining me. And when I first got your email, it's not, like I said, it's not often where I get a cold email and I get excited, right? Usually I'm like, I don't know if that's quite right. It's interesting, but I don't know. But with yours, it was just a short email, and you're like, I would love to talk about how I create empathy and connection to the land through authentic experiences with my students. And I'm like, that sounds pretty cool. Let's definitely do that. And so, so here we are. And I want to dive into getting to know you a little bit, and then into your course, your field ecology and conservation course with your high school students, and really get a deep dive on this experience, because it does sound like a very unique, new way of approaching outdoor education, right? A real way, I should say, right? Like, I feel like there's always this is a spruce tree, this is moss, peat moss, that's a pine beetle, but there's like creating connection and empathy. That's such a different beast. So I'm pumped to have this conversation with you. First of all, I want to know why you wanted to become a teacher, and where that joy of teaching came from.
Teaching has been the only job I've ever wanted to do, specifically high school science teaching.
Okay.
I had some very influential teachers, both in 7th grade and then in 10th grade, my high school years. And it was a job that I knew I could love doing.
Mm.
I was that kid kind of growing up that was outside all the time. And like you said, I could name the spruce, I could name the frogs, all the bird calls and things like that. And I just had that passion for the outdoors and for science and pursued teaching as my career.
That's really cool. It's always nice. My wife was like that. She knew since she was like 10 years old. She's like 10 or 12 or whatever, which was really young. She's like, I want to be a psychologist. And I was like, really? Like, how the hell? Like, I'm 33 and I'm like, is this still, are we sure this is what you want to do? Like, it's like, for those people that have always known, I'm a bit jealous.
For sure.
So that's impressive. And that's really, really cool to have that deep seated of a passion that you just know that this is for you. Right. So yeah, a little more about the teaching specifically of, actually, first of all, before we get to that, what has kept you teaching? Because I know I have people in my family who have started teaching and liked it, but got so worn out and so run down so quickly because of the lack of support and all that they just bailed and they went and did something else. Right. So what keeps you teaching?
Well, that's a real concern nowadays with teacher shortages just due to burnout, especially the last couple of years with the pandemic have been very hard. Mm-hmm. One thing that keeps me teaching is my community of teachers beyond my school. Not that the teachers that I work with in my school are very supportive, is I love my team, but having those fresh ideas and those new ideas coming from teachers outside of my context help keep that creativity and that innovation going. I also I feel a lot of freedom to teach how I think is best for my students, using research-based approaches. So having that freedom also lets me feel that I have a kind of ownership and agency with my own practice.
Yeah. That's cool. Yeah. It's such an underappreciated profession, right? Like I feel like there's so many good teachers that get pushed out of the profession just because of the lack of support and the lack of maybe enthusiasm in their working core group kind of thing, that like, yeah, to find that group that, you can mesh well together and you can find that support and find that drive to keep going is like, yeah, that's great. That's awesome.
I always tell my students that if I ever teach the same thing twice, 2 years in a row, that'll be my last year of teaching, because I always want to be refining and improving everything I possibly can from year to year.
That's awesome. Very, very cool. So why specifically this ecology and conservation course, high school ecology and conservation course? You said you always wanted to do high school science specifically. So what got you into the ecology and conservation?
So, as I mentioned before, I grew up outside. The feral child running around making forts and catching frogs and doing all those types of things. And I had this immense foundational understanding of identification. Okay. But it wasn't until my mid-20s that I had a friend of mine, a mentor really, who made me very aware of how little I actually knew. That although I could name the bird calls and all of the trees and the wildflowers and insects, I wasn't seeing that system. I wasn't seeing the connections and the relationship between those different things. And that was a really profound couple of years where he really helped mentor me and gave me the insight and the opportunity to start seeing some of those connections and really unpacking and understanding the limits of my existing knowledge. That experience in my personal life, I was seeing reflected also in my teaching. My first couple of years of teaching, I taught a traditional environmental science course. And I realized that it's a lot of facts. It's a lot of, here's how the carbon cycle works, or here's a biome, or those types of things. But it lacked that why piece, or that how everything's connected. It didn't have the context for authentic learning. And I really wanted to design a course that created an authentic place so students understood how what they're learning looks like, how what we're learning is applicable to the real world and how it relates to everything around them, not someplace far away, but right here in their backyard.
Yeah. Isn't that true? Like I feel like, I mean, school's been set up that way, right? It's been set up to get you through your tests and give you the information that you need to recall at will and know stuff about things. But to actually make it, like, we're very emotional beings, right? That's at our core, that's what we are. And unless you can make that information emotionally charged somehow, a lot of it's going to be lost. And like, yeah, it's great to understand the carbon cycle. I would argue it's probably a whole lot better to really care about the trees in your local community or whatever than it is to understand how the carbon cycle works, right? Like, you're going to be a better advocate for sustainability if you have a true investment and you really connect to that landscape. And that, like you said, that I feel like school is a lot about teaching the parts. This is this part, this is this part, and there's no stitching of the fabric together and making that weaving, understanding how everything is connected, interconnected, and plays off one another, right? Building that is so much more complicated, but it's also, I feel like, through reading your emails and kind of how you go through things, it seems like it doesn't have to be all that complicated. It seems like you found an interesting way that's, can get people to care about this kind of stuff just by allowing them to spend time. So I think right before we get into the meat and potatoes of this conversation, talking about this course, I think I already know that there's going to be other teachers that are listening that are going to wonder how you got this to happen, because this is a very outside the box approach to teaching high school nature courses, right? Environmental courses. And how did you get this past the school board? Like, there's a lot of, you're going outside, you're spending time outside in the wintertime with this area. It's cold. You're teaching about, social, emotional topics, not so much about like scientific facts quite as clearly. How did you convince the school board to let you do this?
That's a great question. And as I mentioned before, I do feel like I have flexibility to do these things. But that said, it's still an academic course. I changed the name to Field Ecology and Conservation because we're using the processes and the investigative process of ecology and science to explore the outside. Yes. Rather than learning about these things inside, I want to get them out as much as possible. So there's still a classroom component. It's not necessarily lecture and note taking, but my students are designing a way to measure the forest lot that we have on our school. And that social emotional component is not really that's not the goal. It's the product of that process.
I see. Okay.
The social emotional piece is definitely embedded within the thinking, but it's not like I'm going out to create empathy for the rain or for the forest and but in doing it and scaffolding it the way I have it, that is absolutely the outcome, which is intentional on my behalf, I do suppose.
Yeah. That's really cool. I love it. Okay. Well, let's get into it. What is this course? What are you doing in this Field Ecology and Conservation course? Explain it to us.
So Field Ecology and Conservation, it is an elective course, so I do have a little bit more flexibility with that. It's typically for 11th and 12th graders, so about 16 to 18 years old. And it's designed to engage students in the process of ecology, dendrochronology, observation, and just collaboration and communication with one another. And I don't know how deep you want me to go here. Like, I can talk for
go as deep as you want. That sounds good. Wait. I'll cut in every now and again with it.
So the course is, I use Aldo Leopold's land ethic as the foundation of the course. It's one of the first things that we dive into as a class. we really want to understand what an ethic is, and how ethics shape the way we think about different things. And I know in land ethic, Leopold states like a land ethic changes the role of the human from a conqueror to just a plain ordinary citizen of the biotic community. And that, I think, is the goal of the course, is to allow students to see the woodlot and to see the natural world as something that they are a part of, rather than something they're apart from. And the foundation of that experience of how do you go and build a relationship with the natural world? Mm-hmm. We do a practice called sit spot.
Okay.
And as the name suggests, it's a spot where they go to sit. So the very first week of school, or of the semester rather, is in late January in Minnesota. So it's snowy, it's cold, and I take them outside the first week to let them know, like, this is a field-based course. We are going to be outside. We go outside, we find our sit spot, and I invest a lot of time in the beginning of the semester establishing those routines, those expectations. And really it's the ritual of going to sit spot, that this is a place where they are going to individually visit 1 day a week throughout the semester, regardless of the weather condition. Every student is assigned their own tree. They have to be sitting with their back to the tree. I have all my students facing the same way so that they're not looking at each other and doing things like that, as students may do. But it very quickly becomes a routine that students use not just to observe the natural world, but really they start looking in, and they start processing their emotions. They start processing their thinking. They see the health benefits of simply being outside and notice that they're feeling better after they come in from class.
Very cool.
So that's sit spot. And I
have to wonder how many classes it takes for all of them to dress appropriately. Because I remember high school students. I remember being a high school student, and wasn't a lot of jackets going around.
So I'm glad you asked that question, because that's one of my favorite observations. Is the first couple of days we go out, there's always the kid that has his jacket unzipped, and it's always a guy has his jacket unzipped. I don't need a jacket. I don't need a hat. And we come back in, and they appreciate forced air heating for the first time, perhaps ever. And then I bring them out the next time, and these kids come in, and I don't know where they find them, but they're these one-piece snowmobile suits from like 1986 with bright neon green, and they don't care. Fashion is out the window. They are staying warm, and they're ready to go. So that said, I do also have a large bucket of winter clothing and cold weather gear that if they forget, they have to borrow it from the bucket.
I assumed that you probably had a communal bucket, because there's going to be misremembered toques and whatever, right? So, I call them toques in Canada. I guess that's a beanie for those Americans. That's a really cool experience. Like I remember when I was reading about that idea, I was just trying to imagine myself as a high school student having a teacher be like, okay, we're going to go sit by this tree for a semester. You're just going to sit there, and you're going to observe, and you're going to write stuff down, and you're going to just see what happens, see what you notice, see how you feel. And I imagine that, like, as a high school student, I found, at least for myself, I was fairly superficial, right? Like I didn't know who I was or what I was about or what I cared about. I was just kind of floating through it, trying to get by, trying to survive high school, right? And for a class like that would be a fascinating one to help you get away from that high school vibe for a moment, right? And maybe allow some of that introspection and I don't know, realness. The realness of connection to nature it's a fascinating idea that I never really considered as a way to connect. But of course, like the forest bathing idea has been big for a while, and it was poo-pooed at first as hippy dippy and weird, and then everyone's kind of getting on board now. They're like, no, it is pretty nice to sit barefoot in the forest and just kind of like breathe it in. You're like, that's feels pretty good. Like,
and I'm in the process of doing some academic research with some collaborators at Clemson and at Antioch universities. And part of that research was doing interviews with my former students. And some of which had been out of the classroom for almost a decade or more.
Yeah.
And some of the insight and vivid memories that these students had of their sit spots it's the part of teaching that you very often don't see. You don't see how your teaching impacts a kid later after they leave your classroom. But these students shared experiences, memories that are affecting them still to this day. And like you mentioned, that it helped them find themselves. It helped ground them while they were in a very stressful part of their life in high school for academic, personal, or other reasons. SitSpot helped provide a space for them to process that, to find themselves, and to see themselves as see the world as something bigger around them.
Yeah, for sure. No, I remember high school being the worst. I didn't like high school at all. I was just stressed all the time. And it was just like, not even stressed about workload. You're just stressed about the social dynamics of high school and kids that, I don't know. It was brutal. So like to have a class where you can just kind of be alone for a moment and, absorb something that's real, not the bullshit of high school politics. I can't imagine the impact that might have on a student, right?
And I do want to stress that SitSpot is not just like going out and doing whatever you want. I do have an academic component to it as well. So when they're at their SitSpot, it's that's their time. That's their authentic journaling. I'm not going to tell them what to look for. I'm not going to tell them like, oh, record this. This is where they're doing sketches or they're doing reflections or just spilling their heart out onto the page. When they come back in, I do give them all a reflection that is based on content. So how are you seeing abiotic factors present in your sit spot, or how, looking at ecological relationships or things like that. So it's based on the content that we're studying in class, but now they're applying those real world experiences. And another piece is I give feedback on everything in their journals. So I'm reading their journals every week and giving them feedback. I'm not correcting grammar or things like that. Most often I'm just asking questions, and those questions are designed to help them think deeper or think beyond where they're at. And I really want them to push themselves every week. I want to see that growth of digging deeper, making new connections, and thinking about themselves or the world around them a little bit differently, continually throughout the semester.
That's really cool. I like that critical thinking aspect of being able to step outside of your immediate thought bubble and into something else, right? Like that's something that, university always claims to create, but like there's no reason that you can't start that early, right? So that's very, very interesting. Yeah, it's one part that I wish the critical thinking aspect was more of a part in in most high school classes, because it feels like a lot of times you're just trying to get through it, right? But let people think for a moment, and then instead of just memorizing. That's perfect.
In addition to, I think another thing with SitSpot is that building that ritual and expectation that the students very quickly see the value in having that authentic freedom of SitSpot and the power to take ownership. It's really that idea of student agency, and it's always fun. I can tell they're really jiving when it's that first rainy day or that first really cold day. Last winter, it was 13 below zero Fahrenheit. And I asked the students if they wanted to go, and they're like, absolutely. So they got everything on it. It's 13 below. It's about the coldest air temperature without the wind. And we went out and we did SitSpot. Or in the spring when it's raining and the kid doesn't have rain gear, I'll bring out some big old trash bags and they'll poke a head and some arms, and they're going out in SitSpot and they are dedicated to doing it. I really believe because they see the value in the experience, and almost the novelty of it is what makes it powerful.
Yep. Yep. No, it's not often. Isn't it funny that like they could do that on their own time? It's like, yeah, you could leave school and go sit by a tree, but there's no one's going to do that. So like you need something like the class being like, this is what you're doing now. And you're like, okay, I guess that's what I'm doing now. There's no option. And like that change all of a sudden, now that there's not the option to go play Xbox or whatever else you might be doing, it changes the expectations, or I guess what you're capable of. I guess you're capable of committing to that experience a little more fully, right? Which is a really interesting opportunity for them that a lot of people wouldn't get, including adults.
Right. And I've had students who actually they've done sit spot at home, and or if they graduate, they've done sit spot at college. They found trees because they find that value in doing it. Which that to me as a teacher, if you can take anything from my class and apply it to your real life and see the value in it, I think that's the ultimate goal of teaching is affecting that student's life and or thinking beyond your classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. How many do you think in your class, because I guess any high school elective, right, you'll have people taking it because they think it's easy or whatever, right? And maybe not taking it because they're totally engaged or committed to the topic. How many of these people lean into this and really get into it? How many people do you find start with a little bit of apprehension and like, I don't know, I'm a little bit too cool for this or whatever, right? And it takes, like, how many do you win over by the time it's all said and done?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because that's so dependent on the group of students that's there.
Yeah.
Very early when I first started doing this, I had a student who, when the students are doing sit spot, I'm out there doing it with them. So I'm in the woods with them. And this student, I knew he was not using his time at sit spot wisely. This is when cell phones first became kind of a really big thing. And so he was on his phone and his journals reflected that he was not putting his effort in. And we usually do about 10 to 12 sit spots per semester. And he got to sit spot number, I think it was like 8 or 9. And he realized that he had been squandering this opportunity. And he wrote the final, at that point, the final project was to do a final reflection. And he wrote this like 10-page paper that was more or less a warning to other students not to squander this opportunity. And he was regretting and lamenting his choices throughout the semester and how he realized toward the end that this could have been so much more. Some kids definitely don't buy into it as much. I'm not going to lie. Some kids don't, but a big part of that, I don't think we can dodge this topic is how the grade is calculated. Grades drive so much of student learning, unfortunately.
Right.
And one thing that I've strived for in this class is to make it less about the grade and more about the learning. And so I've most recently switched to a portfolio-based grading system, where students collect data throughout the semester, and I'll use check-ins, and based on a rubric, they have to argue for what they think their grade is. Or their final grade should be. So they use 5 pieces of evidence to argue, like, here's how I met these different components of the rubric, and here's the grade I think I deserve.
That's interesting. You're almost preparing them for grad school at that point.
Yeah, it's fun because then if you take that grade kind of hovering over them, then they start taking risks. Then they start pushing themselves. Then they really buy into the experience that I'm not doing this for points. I'm doing this because I know what I need to do to get to where I want to be. So again, it takes a lot of work for me on my end to monitor that. But I think the value on the student side is it helps reinforce that authentic nature of learning and awareness of what you're learning throughout the semester.
Yeah. That is fascinating. Yeah, I love this. And it's clearly creating a much deeper connection to the information, right?
Well, I think there's another, to link this back to kind of the idea of conservation and the environment. It helps maintain and create that hope that if uh, because it's an elective, oftentimes there's students that they need this to graduate. This is the science credit they need, and they might not have been successful in other science classes. And these are students that if they, in a traditional grading scale, they might be statistically impossible to pass at some point. And so then they just give up hope. And why am I here? I can't pass. But switching it to that authentic, more authentic approach towards growth throughout the semester, they know there's still that opportunity that they can move up, that they can get there. And I think when we look at look at ideas of the environment conservation, the hope is what it's so easy to lose when you see all the things that are happening around us to the natural world. It's easy to lose that hope, that we sometimes forget that there's still those opportunities for us to make changes to conserve the world around us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's building that connection it's such a challenging topic. I think you're doing what like all teachers want to ultimately do, right? You figured out a way through it for your content, which is impressive. And it's hard. It's so hard. I couldn't imagine trying to build something like this from scratch, being like, how do I get these people to care and to understand what I'm trying to get across, this whole connection to land and how everything is interconnected. And it's fascinating. So what do you feel like? I mean, I can't imagine reading these journals, like letting these people know that, like, hey, you're going to write these journals, you're going to write down these things, and I'm going to read them, and that has to be a bit, because they'll be curating their thoughts based off the knowledge that this is not private, right? And so that has to be a little bit different. And like, yeah, how am I graded? Like you said, right? You're grading them off the quality of thought and the attempt, right? More than the spelling and the grammar and everything else. So, but it must be incredibly powerful experience for you, as well as for them, to be sitting there reading this content and you must get a wide array of perspectives, and you must have come across ideas or thoughts that you weren't thinking about yourself, hadn't come across, hadn't realized. So how is this specific part of the course? I know this is just one part of the course. I know there's more to it than this. We're spending a lot of time on it, but I think it's a really unique thing to do. Yeah. What have you gotten out of this? Like, what kind of new ideas have come across your mind through reading students' semi-private journal entries?
I think the first part of your question there, it's really, you have to develop trust with students.
Yeah.
I mean, trust to take them outside in the first place. And that this course is really, is based on trust and community, that I tell them the very first day, this isn't my class, this is your class. We're going to do things in here where I need to have 100% trust in you. So building that trust for them to be more authentic in their journals, really helps them open up. And kids have poured their hearts into it. And that's been very powerful to me, just to know that I've created a community and affected some of these kids in ways that I didn't even realize were happening.
Yeah.
And kids are going through a lot, not just for their age, but just socially, mentally, everything. And some kids have just spilled their guts into that journal, which is, I find it's an honor for me that they would trust me to share those things with me. The second part of that question, yeah, I love reading it because, yes, then I get that same experience. I get to grow and notice different things, or they see a bird or this plant, and it helps me better think about how can I explain what I understand? How do I articulate that? But also they're seeing connections that like, oh, I didn't know that, or I didn't realize that. It also reveals some very common misconceptions. Like birds live in nests is a very common misconception, that regardless of the time of year, birds go and live in nests.
Right.
In the middle of January for some reason. it gives me an opportunity to better understand where each of my students is, so that I can better support them, not just at SitSpot, but also in the other parts of the class. So I know their strengths, I know their limitations, and I can see those as opportunities to better support their growth as an individual in the rest of the coursework.
Gotcha. Before we move on, I think you're gonna have to explain where do birds live, because that might be a question for someone sitting here listening, being like, okay, so where the hell do they live then, bud?
Yeah, so birds typically live in nests only when they're breeding with young. They're not going to go back to a nest to sleep. Although some birds, like cavity nesters, chickadees and nuthatches and things like that, they'll sleep in cavities, but those cavities are typically not the same ones that they're using as nesting cavities. So yeah, those big nests you see on tops of trees or in bushes, birds are not coming and sleeping in those. That's just for rearing their young.
Right, just for springtime stuff. Yeah, okay, perfect. Thank you for clearing that up. It's something I always have to be aware of. I'm like, hey, we should answer that question that person just brought up. So yeah. No, it's absolutely, it's very, very cool. I love it. It's I know I've had the opportunity to teach some plant ID stuff and some ecology stuff, ecosite stuff up in northern Alberta, and specifically with some Indigenous communities, and teaching the kind of Western model of that, right? But I always go into it knowing that there's a certain level of connection and skill that they're going to have that I won't have, and I don't go into it knowing that I'm the only one who knows something here. I always go into it being like, hey, we're here to teach each other. I know a specific way of understanding these plants. I'm happy to help you. But please feel free to interact and communicate with me, your experiences. And there's been so many times where, they've come up. I can't remember the specific example, but they came up and they're like, smell this. And I was like, smell it. And they're like, doesn't that smell like lemons or something? And I was like, holy crap, it does smell like lemons. And like, just like weird, like using different senses is something that I never would have, picked up just like a forb off the ground and smelled it. It's always like, the leaves look like this. Okay, I'll look it up. I'll key it out in my book. Oh, that's this plant. Oh, and this is what it says it's used for. Cool. And then throw it away. Instead of like smelling it, give it a little nibble and just like interacting with it in different ways. And you don't get that unless you are talking to people that have a different perspective than you have, right? And I think that's a lot of like academia in general tends to struggle with that concept, right? Because I feel like academia has often been like, well, we're the holders of the knowledge, like we're the ones that know the stuff and have the things and do the looking, and I mean, things have changed a little bit. I think people are more aware that there's a lot of different ways of knowing now, and that those perspectives and values change depending on who you are and what you know. And so I think academia is opening up a little bit more and bringing in more of those soft sciences, bringing in more of the different ways of knowing, which is fantastic. But I think that's still an issue, right? There's still that. So to be able to read the personal thoughts of people that are going through this has to be a fantastic way to keep your mind from stagnating around this subject. Mm-hmm.
For sure. Right? Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up the multiple ways of knowing and the senses specifically. On those first days I take them out, I always find a little piece of aspen and let them all taste the inner bark of the aspen. And that's, the aspartame, that's where it's a painkiller that has been used for generations, thousands of years. And the other part of that is throughout the semester, I'll do what I call a SitSpot challenge. And one of my favorites is a blind sit where they go and they sit down and they just close their eyes and just have to make all their observations using all of those other senses.
Oh yeah.
And it is fascinating because they have been at this spot then for 6 weeks, 6 times. As soon as they close their eyes, everything it's terrifying. It's terrifying. And no
matter how old you are, you're always afraid of the dark.
Yes. But they'll say they think time changes and the sound changes and they can smell or hear things they couldn't hear before. And just layering on those other senses helps us better experience reality in a more objective way.
Totally. Yeah, isn't that funny? As humans, we're so dependent on vision. Everything is about vision, what I can read, what I can see, what I can look at. It's never there's so many ways of perceiving, and this is like it's not like light doesn't get bent and changed and shifted, and
Right.
my cones and rods are different than your cones and rods, and there's gonna be different ways of perceiving, and like talk to a blind person, right, or a deaf person, or what, and like see how they perceive that, and it's funny we get so caught in this like this is my way of perceiving and understanding, and this must be the only way. You don't even realize that there's other ways of doing this, right? It's not like you're being arrogant or anything. You've just never been exposed to different ideas. And it's fascinating.
And I think that those experiences where you're pushed beyond that comfort zone is where you start to build that empathy, because the natural world isn't based on vision. The natural world is full of sense and sounds that we are completely incapable of experiencing. And when you push yourself to experience things in a different way like that, you start to build that understanding that there's more out there. And that's really the foundation of where empathy, I think, comes from.
Absolutely. I think for me, one of the big aha moments for me around understanding this concept of you don't know what you don't know kind of thing, right? And stepping outside of my cultural experience and into another was I can't remember exactly when it happened. I think it was during when I was doing the Good Fire podcast, which is in Indigenous cultural burning podcast, where we talk with Indigenous folks from around the world that are doing that, right? And listening to them talk and recognizing, it was the first time I recognized colonialism as my culture, right? Like that, my way of understanding the world is completely embedded in the concept and result of colonialism, and that there are infinite number of ways of viewing, organizing, and making a community and a society than just that one very specific way, right? And it wasn't until I was able to talk to people who are living in their traditional areas, living traditionally, where you start to go, oh yeah, that is interesting. That is a different way of knowing. And it's hard. Like I said, it's nearly impossible to step outside of your culture and create empathy for other cultures, right? But if you're able to do that, it opens up everything, and you start questioning everything you thought you knew, right?
It's that idea of not just knowing what you don't know, but knowing that there's things you don't know.
Yeah, and being okay with that. So the sit spot, obviously, I think we've exhausted. I mean, we could keep talking about it, but there's more to talk about. We got the gist. So so there's more to this thing. There's more to this course. Specifically, I'm expecting you want to talk about the giant, I think it was oak cookies that you have in class, right?
Yeah.
So explain this part of the project.
So I really started liking trees when I realized how little I knew about them. As I had mentioned before, like I could name all the trees, I could name them, but then I never really understood them as individuals or as even a species. And then as I started to get more excited about trees, I started bringing that excitement into my classroom. And I started with getting these little tree cookies and starting to try to pick apart the tree rings. I was hustling people from, there's a tree down there, like, hey, can I get a cookie from that? And so I started collecting these tree cookies with more species, more diversity, and trying to help my students better understand that. But it really changed when I was contacted by a local couple that lost a very large old bur oak. It's about 37 inches across, which in this area is a very old tree.
Yep. My area as well.
I processed or sanded it down and had it, I sealed it up, and I use that tree now as a foundation of understanding the history of the land. So there's this idea of understanding the way things are now, but the land and most of the natural world doesn't move in a time scale or a time frame that humans are really capable of understanding.
Right.
And I use this tree as a mechanism or a tool to really engage my students in that temporal time scale of change. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's been really fun to watch the students try to understand, A, how do you read a tree looking at its rings, and B, just the number of things that influence tree growth and shape and size. Every year, my students count back, and they always get to about 1820.
Ah.
And they're like, well, what happened in Minnesota before 1820?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, that's a great question. And this tree goes back to about 1756.
Oh, wow.
And they realize that they've only been taught this very limited perspective of colonial Minnesota, with the other 10 to 12,000 years or more as the first chapter in their Minnesota Studies book.
Yeah.
And so that idea that this one tree can not only unlock the history of the land that it grew on, but also that history of the people on the land is a very powerful experience.
Yeah. So how do you go about doing that? How do you go about teaching them, first of all, how to read a tree? So you mentioned earlier the concept of dendrochronology. That's what this is, the concept of counting backwards in time using tree rings, basically, and using those tree rings and what would it be? The aspect, I guess not the aspect, but the qualities of that tree ring can tell you certain things about the season through which it grew. So tell me about, how do you go about teaching this? Because I think about being in a class as a high school student, and our teacher goes, okay, we're going to count tree rings. And everyone just kind of goes, what do you mean? But it's so much more than that. So tell me about this process.
Well, that was a very accurate imitation of how some students respond.
I was a kid once.
This is the grand question, and it's another example of where I'm using my own learning to push my students, but B, also identifying some very basic misconceptions. So
Right.
I start where the students are, and we do a very basic just anatomy of a tree. So all the different layers that make up a tree. And one of my favorite questions is I ask them, I have a segment of a tree cookie, or it's a slice of trees, and I say, label the oldest and label the youngest rings. As simple as that. And every single year, it is split about 50-50, that the youngest rings are in the middle or the youngest rings are on the outside, which brings this discussion in of, well, how do trees even grow?
Yeah.
And at a foundational level, that's what this is about, is understanding trees as these dynamic beings rather than these stagnant things. And a lot of people don't understand how trees even grow. And it's not an intuitive way of growing, just this cone of tissue being added on every year.
Yeah. And honestly,
so
I've been in professional settings where someone's been like, yeah, you can tell that this tree is old because the prayer wrap that someone put on this tree is now 30 feet in the air, and it would have been down here earlier. And everyone kind of looks at one another. We're like, that's not how. So we should explain this, because it's not exactly. It's not that intuitive. So please explain, how do trees grow?
So trees have a layer called the cambium layer, and it's right underneath the bark. And it's kind of growing two ways from that cambium layer. It's growing out to make the bark, and it's growing also kind of out, but it's adding a new layer of wood. So it's what we call the sapwood. So every year it's adding on two layers of this sapwood. There's the early wood, and then there's the young wood. At the same time, it's also producing bark that's getting pushed out. And just like our skin, that bark eventually sloughs off. So if you were to look at bark, you would see the same rings in that bark that you see in that sapwood and then heartwood deeper into the tree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the idea is that the point in the tree, like if you were to put a nail in a tree, that nail's never moving. It's always going to be at that spot that you put it, because a tree grows from the tips outward. So the apical, so the very top, all the buds, that's where the new growth comes out. It's not like the tree's growing out of the ground. It's in the ground and it's growing outwards from its tips. And so that's a very basic concept that, I remember being in my first forestry job. I hadn't actually started forestry school. I was doing just doing some basic college courses, knowing I was going into forestry, but wasn't doing that yet. And someone had to explain that to me in a meeting, because I didn't know. I hadn't done it yet, right? Because it's not intuitive. You just assume. They're like, oh yeah, they just like kind of grow. There's like more of it coming out of the ground every year, but it's not. That's not the case. So yeah.
and so once we go do those real basic things, I do another little lab on gravitropism, phototropism. We talk about primary terminal buds versus lateral buds. We do. Perhaps I should explain the whole project to give a larger context. The goal of this project is I want students to tell me the history of the land through 3 different contexts. I want them to tell me the history of this giant tree. I want them to tell me the history of the tree community in the forest. And I want them to tell me the human history of the land and how those 3 interplay.
Interesting.
So that's a huge ask, and
no kidding.
I've collaborated with a dendrochronologist who I can talk about just in a moment, and he said that's like a master's thesis that I'm asking my class to collectively do every year. So I start with those basic ideas, so they really get to know how to identify trees, how to see trees as individuals. They can go look at tree shapes. And explain why does this tree look the way it does? We talk about primary versus secondary growth, really looking at that whole lifespan of a tree.
So what kind of things are in this? So just to paint a picture for folks that have never done any kind of dendrochronology, never counted tree rings, never had that privilege, what kind of things are you looking for in tree rings that indicate that something has happened? Something that you can indicate as this is an event, this is an event, this is an event. Try and explain that to us.
Sure. Well, first, I think it's worth mentioning I've collaborated with Dan Griffin at the University of Minnesota in his lab, and he has this open access software. It's called Elevator, where he has taken super high resolution images of tree cores. And I've sent him my cores that he's then digitized. And now students can zoom in almost to the cellular level, and we can see those
so cool.
Those tree rings, and we can measure them digitally. So we can get these huge data sets. We can compare one species to another. We can compare 2 individuals. It's been a very, very powerful resource for my students to engage in the process.
That's crazy. That's an incredible resource. Yeah, that's cool. I want to be a part of this.
Yeah. But to answer your question, you're looking for patterns, and that's one of the foundational processes of science is just looking for patterns. So if you notice that there's 2 rings that are very close together, something happened to that tree. Was that a drought? Was that a disease? Was that something else happened to the tree? Or those rings can get further apart, and that means it was a good growth, or maybe a tree next to it fell down and gave it more light on that side. And so my students start digging into, this big, huge tree cookie, and they start looking at these events and like, well, what happened here? And they're counting down the years, and they find the dust bowls of the 1930s are clear as day. The big one, and this is, I'm not 100% sure, but this, the rings around 1815 are infinitesimally small. There's about 20 years where this tree did not grow at all. And when I first looked at these rings, I was trying to figure that out. And the only thing I can think of with my one limited sample size is Tambora. Tambora was the supervolcano that erupted, and it caused what we called the year without a summer. In 1815, there was snow across the northern hemisphere in June and July. And this tree, it matches perfectly with that event, which from a Minnesota people history, European settlement really started pushing in about 1819 was when the big first fort for the U.S. Army was put in Minnesota. And now I can't help but think about how did that affect the people on the land? These years with depressed temperatures and game was less and food stocks are less. And now you have this invading army coming in and changing and interacting with the land. And really, if you're hurting for a couple of years without food, you're going to be much easier to influence into maybe making some treaties or decisions that aren't in your best interests.
Yeah, no kidding, right? Yeah, tying. I don't know why, but I don't think I ever really considered it that way until your email explaining it, kind of thing, right? Explaining the whole concept of thinking about how the colonial aspect ties into like looking at tree growth, right? For me, it's always been, I'm always thinking about the environmental factors, like, oh yeah, there's a burn scar here, so there must have been a fire that year, or whatever. There's all kinds of different things, right? But like you said, a drought or a good growth year or really sunny or whatever. But then looking back and tying that back to the human history is a whole nother dimension that even I never really considered. And it brings about, I suppose in Canada, unless you're in kind of BC, there's not a lot of 300-year-old trees. They exist, but they're kind of in top of the mountain or middle of a peat bog or something like that. But we have a lot of 200-year-old trees, so there's no reason to say you can't do that. I just never made that connection. So even for me, that's a huge opportunity to make another connection to like how this all make it real, right? Instead of just something you read in a book, this is something. Look, I can see the impact on this tree of what happened in, what you called it, Tambora, the volcano.
Tambora, yeah.
Where was that?
Indonesia.
In Indonesia, okay, and it just kind of covered the northern hemisphere.
Big super volcano, erupted. The other unique thing about the bigger tree cookie that I have is it does have metal staining on it. So sometime around 1815-ish, someone pounded a nail or a staple or something into the tree, and so I have this big metal stain that goes up and on both sides. So it offers that illustration of something happened to this tree. You can't see the nail, but it was someplace above or below, and just that movement of water and sugars rusted the wood around that nail.
Isn't that, yeah, like, it's just, these are little things we don't think about, right? Doing a little bit of investigation just can teach you so much, right? Just by being observant, just by paying attention, you can learn so much about the world around you. And it's right there. All it takes is counting the rings and having a buddy with a super high resolution imagery capacity that you can look at things at the cellular level. But I mean, we won't talk about that so much.
Right. Well, and I think what you said is it's important these are student questions. This is not me telling them the story of this tree. Yeah. This is not me telling them the story of the woods. They are driving these questions. They're trying to figure out these answers. And it's like a 2-week process, but they come up with a way to survey all of the trees out in this forest. So I'm looking for density, diversity, distribution, and age. And they're out there debating with each other and trying to figure out what's the most effective way to sample 2 acres of woodlot. And that's not an easy task. So they're collaborating, they're taking ownership to tell this story. So it's not like, hey, here's the story I want you to tell. They are coming up with the things that they need to do in order to tell the story that they know is there. They have to uncover those bits and pieces.
I love that. Isn't that cool to just like allowing the students to steer this experience, right? And like, I think there's so much here to be taken away of like, no matter what you teach, how can you engage your students, and getting them to do something and to feel a connection, I think is the first way to get them interested. And then you can start to dive a little deeper and have interesting conversations, right? So really cool.
And it's also that they're not just learning about a science thing. They're using math. They're using their interpersonal skills. They're using their writing skills, their reading skills. They're doing all of these different things in this one course. So it's I think that helps keep it fresh and helps build on the strengths of individual students. Some kids are really good at talking, but maybe not so good at math. And so when they're forced to work together, they have to find those strengths that they have or that others have and rely on each other to build that interconnectedness and that resilience to get through the challenge, which has obvious connections to the larger ecosystem.
Absolutely. So I think I want to take this out another step and just kind of and ask you about the larger impact that I know you were talking at the beginning about how you've been reaching out to students, 10 years down the line, and how this course has helped them and changed their perspective and permanently made an impact on them, which is like every teacher's dream, right? To know how you've changed lives, right? In a positive way. What has been the larger impact on the community as a result of this course?
Yeah, students. There was a proposal to remove the woodlot convert it to parking several years ago now, and students rallied behind.
Classic bad guy move.
Right. Yeah. So students rallied and went to school board meetings, went to committee meetings, and spoke about the power of their experience at SitSpot, and really, touched the hearts of the school board to make a different decision, that we don't need more parking, but we do need some space with trees that are hundreds of years old. And I think part of that process really revealed that how much we take for granted. That every day we drive by this community that's been there since the glaciers receded, pretty much, that has trees that have been there for hundreds of years. But we just see that as unused space, or we don't see the community. And so I think
it's unproductive.
Right, unproductive, yeah.
Yeah.
So the students really took the reins on that, and really they saved that forest from being cut down for parking spaces.
Right. Yeah. That's awesome. I love it. It seems like you're just trying to make citizens that are thinking critically about aspects about the environment and nature and local community and the importance of an individual tree, right? And all of its values that it may contain.
Well, I firmly believe that if we are going to really make changes at a global scale, we have to understand and appreciate the hyper-local environment and recognize our impacts on it. That we have to be able to see the value of a tree and honor the stories that it has, really treat it as an elder. What can we learn from this tree to help, and what can we do to ensure that this tree can continue growing, or that its offspring can continue to grow? The wisdom that we have available is right in front of us. We just have to be willing to find it and listen to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it changes. I like that concept of treating it like an elder. I've been in a lot of discussions. Forest management, at least in Canada, is changing a lot. The way we do the planning, the way we do the pre-planning, and there's a lot more people that are involved now, right? And there's been discussions, there's been ideas thrown around about when you do forest harvest, right? And of having the local indigenous communities come out and have a cultural. There's a lot of giving back, right? In a lot of indigenous communities, you don't take anything from nature unless you give something back. So there's a lot of gifting of tobacco, right, to the land, and it changes your relationship to the resource. Instead of treating it like a tree to be cut down for a 2x4, which is something we need, you're treating it like, okay, this costs something, and we've done the math, and the tree's going to grow back. We're going to plant. We're going to make sure that this is sustainable in a wood volume kind of way and all that kind of thing. But there's more to this. If you make it so you have to give something back, even if it's something just like a tobacco ceremony, like indigenous groups do. I'm not suggesting that that's the way. I'm just saying that idea of giving back to the land, not just making sure that the land is okay, but actually making sure the land can thrive while we use its resources. I think that's treating it like an elder. I think that's a good way to put it, right? Treating that thing with respect, that tree with respect, and knowing that even though we may use its resources, there's so much more involved than just growing wood. There's a lot more there, and respecting it as such, right?
And I think a big part of that, of building that respect and that appreciation comes from viewing the forest and or trees across that larger temporal span. Understanding that a forest is not something you can just plant and get right back. A forest is a dynamic system of different age groups. It's just a community, a community of people have different ages, different jobs, different components. And if we see them all as just one thing, we're missing the larger story. So seeing the forest and how it has changed in a human lifetime, and understanding how we could very quickly be changing it even faster in the future, helps us better understand what we need to do now to ensure the stability and the in perpetuity of those places that we love.
Yeah. It's such a complicated thing to try and manage, right? Like, we've been trying to do sustainable forest management for decades. And every year that goes by, we go, there's something we have to add. There's something we have to think about differently. And that's sustainability, right? Like Gary Merkel, a gentleman I've talked to a few times on the podcast, he's said that sustainability is not an end goal. It is a way of living. It's always changing. When you think you figured it out, it changes again. And that's always going to be true. So this is going to be an ever-moving target. And I think recognizing that, we need to continue to add complexity to this system if we want to hedge our bets and make sure that we're not depleting the landscape in any way, right? So it's creating empathy and connection to the land is the first step to that. Creating people that care and are able to think critically about something like a forest and all of its values and what it has to offer and what it has to contribute, requires, first of all, that they care about it. And it seems like you're accomplishing that. So what I want to ask is what kind of reputation now that you've gotten a bit of a reputation, I'm assuming that this class is something that is talked about. It sounds like it's outside the box. It seems like there's a lot of connection. It seems like people might be pretty excited a lot of times to take this course before they're even in it. What has the enrollment been like now that you've created a reputation? I'm imagining the first couple of years were probably kind of slow until you built something. But how has that been? Are people clamoring over one another to get into your class?
Yeah, I have to cap my numbers. It's been a popular class, and as I mentioned earlier, it's not one single demographic. There's some kids that they are barely passing. They need this class to graduate. There's other kids who they're going into this stuff. This is stuff they dig. And I think that's another part of what I just love about this class is we get this totally non-homogeneous group of kids coming together, and consistently year in, year out, I am now really good friends with people I never thought I could even talk to by the end of the course. And so they're building these relationships and seeing people differently than they did when they came in. And I think the structure of the course is a huge part of that shift. And they're seeing themselves and seeing each other differently, the same way that they're hopefully seeing the land a little bit differently as well.
That's so cool. It's so hard to do that, right? High school is hard. Everybody's got their group, they got their clique, they got their thing that they're into, and it's uncool to do this and it's uncool to do that, and you can't talk to that person because so-and-so said so, and it's all just this, it's all petty bullshit. And to be able to raise those kids, I say kids, but they're young adults, right? Like they're thinking complexly about the world more than most full-grown adults are, I imagine. But to be able to, raise them above that and allow them to see, that's all bullshit. It doesn't matter. That's a huge accomplishment in and of itself. So, yeah, I love this whole concept, and I hope people hear this and kind of run with their own ideas along the same lines, because I think this is so doable, right? It's so doable in so many different ways. Maybe they don't have access to like I said, the super high resolution photography for the tree cookie, but you can still do all of that without that. That's just an extra layer. And you know what? Just look up dendrochronology in your city and see what pops up. Reach out to that lab, and I bet you they would love if they are like, hey, I got a bunch of high school kids that are interested in dendrochronology. They'll go, what, really? Yeah, I'll help. Like, it's you could totally get it to happen. So I think this is super doable and really cool, novel idea. And just it's just exciting, right? So I applaud you for making this happen and for doing something cool like this. Do you have anything any final thoughts that you want to leave with?
Yeah, you don't have to do everything I just said to get some of the same results. Simply taking your kids outside and giving students the opportunity to have authentic experiences, taking some of that structure away, gives them the very basics of that confidence to start seeing and experiencing the natural world in a more authentic way. So you don't have to reinvent your whole course. It could be just one day a week, and we're going to go outside and we're just going to observe. We're just going to take some notes. And it's not limited to science either. So I would encourage anybody who works with young kids, take your kids outside, let them get their feet muddy, let them listen to the birds, let them get scratched by some branches and experience the world for what it is.
Yeah. Ask questions, buy some plant ID books, some insect books, some mushroom books, and learn it together, right? Like, just it's fun to explore. I do that with my 4-year-old all the time, right? It's fun. I love it. Just get them engaged. Well, thanks so much, Jim. This was a real pleasure for me. I love being able to sit down with somebody and really get into the weeds on some of this stuff, right? And really get deep into it and figure out why this is working, why this isn't working, and how we can do things differently and think about things in a different way. So, yeah, thank you so much for your contribution, and good luck.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, this was fantastic. Wasn't that awesome? Sometimes it's nice to hear about tangible things that we can do that make a difference. Something as simple as getting your students to go and sit by a tree and write down their thoughts, and then connect that back to the science, connect that back to the real world. It's awesome. And then getting them to assess this stump, this tree cookie, and tie that back to human historical events, and tie that back to drought years and volcanoes and all kinds of stuff, and allow them to just see this web kind of be uncovered. Isn't that awesome? I love it. It's so tangible, so doable. Thank you, Jim, for all that you do. I hope this course just keeps on going, and I hope more people create something like it in their school. So thank you. If you have any questions for myself or for Jim, you can shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and I will get back to you. And make sure to rate and review, share this with your friends and family, all that stuff. It makes, if you listen to this podcast before, it's free content. You don't have to pay for it. All the least you could do is tell a friend. Share it on social media. It would really mean the world to me. Thank you. I really appreciate it. We'll catch you all next time. Take it easy.